Hello, my name is Claudia Edwards, and I'm here to talk to you about my dissertation project for Bangor University, exploring the impact of Covid-19 and its effects on well-being and satisfaction with life. First of all, natural disasters have shown a direct effect on well-being and life satisfaction. These natural disasters can be those such as hurricanes, earthquakes, and floods. Heightened anxiety, aggression levels, depression, and the possibility of a development of PTSD have been identified as the most common onset mental health problems after a disaster. Hurricane Katrina, which took place in the Gulf Coast in 2005, showed high incidence of onset mental health concerns and diagnosis, such as the doubling of major depressive disorders, panic disorders, generalized anxiety disorders, and PTSD. When looking back at the population of the Gulf Coast 14 years later, these consequences on mental health can still be observed today. So, while looking at these natural disasters, very similar psychological implications can be seen during a pandemic. A pandemic refers to a new disease which may be severe, infectious, contagious, and can be spread globally. An example of a pandemic is the severe acute respiratory syndrome. This pandemic began in the 21st century, and research found that infected individuals had an increase of anxious feelings and stress. They discovered that there was a rise of 30% of symptoms of depression and PTSD. When looking at the people quarantining with SARS, they found that the fears came from areas such as being lonely in quarantine, experiencing anger, the boredom that they could face, and the worry about family members and friends. They also found that daily life and well-being of the individuals during this time was majorly affected. They found that people experienced a collective decline in future security, feeling a part of society, a general standard of living, and intimate relationships. So, coronavirus has been defined by the World Health Organization as an infectious disease which mainly affects the body's respiratory functions. With the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, many countries have been taking part in quarantining or lockdown processes to stop the spread of the coronavirus. United Kingdom's biggest problem associated with the lockdown has been researched to be the loss of normality and social freedom. They expressed these losses as an implementation of social distancing, cancelling of gatherings, cancelling of events, huge travel restrictions within the UK, and the closing of schools and workplaces. With the loss of normality and social freedom, Buse, Steptoe and Fancourt suggested that these implications also lead to a development of loneliness during lockdown, with the risk factors to this being young adults, people living alone, and females, with students being the highest risk factor group in developing loneliness in lockdown. So, the biggest question yet to be answered is the effect of COVID-19 on mental well-being and life satisfaction. Life satisfaction can be described as how satisfied a person may be with their life as a whole, whereas well-being can be used as using contentment and psychological performance elements to assess a person's well-being in life. Our study aims to combat this question in relevance to exploring these effects on the population of the United Kingdom. We hypothesize a significant negative effect on well-being and life satisfaction scores during the lockdown timeframes of the COVID-19 pandemic. We also expect to see some improvement with the well-being and life satisfaction scores in the post-lockdown timeframe as daily life may return to some normality. With relevance to the background research and our population aiming to have a high proportion of students, we can also anticipate an uptrend in significance to loneliness during the lockdown period. We gathered 214 participants. Our participants were recruited for two main sources: Sona, a student participant panel site, and Facebook's and Twitter advertisements. The target population we advertised for was people living in the United Kingdom during the COVID-19 pandemic. For our study, we adopted a mixed methods design. We replicated the survey that we created so it was available for English speakers and Welsh speakers. The study also adopted a repeated measures design, as we asked the participants to answer 2 questionnaires in 3 time frames, such as before, during, and after the pandemic. Our independent variable was the different time frames of the pandemic, and the dependent variables were the well-being scores used the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, and the higher the person scored on this questionnaire, the more what their wellbeing was measured. And also the life satisfaction scores were measured using the satisfaction with life scale, and the higher the person scored on this questionnaire, the more satisfied with life they were. We also devised some long answer questions to assess how the COVID pandemic actually affected each participant. The participants were required to use an internet-connected device to be able to fill out the survey, and we designed our survey and obtained the data from the participants using the website Qualtrics. Before starting the survey, the participant needed to read through the consent form and the instructions so the participants could understand and agree with the statements before consenting. The participant must have manually agreed to all the statements to consent to the participant to gain electronic access to the rest of the survey. So we started the survey by asking our participants some demographic questions. These included ones such as age, gender and ethnicity, but we also asked them to disclose if they had a disability or a mental health disorder. The next section was some lockdown questions. So we asked the questions of whether the participants were shielding during the lockdown, caring for anyone who's shielding, working as a key worker, working from home, furloughed from work, caring for children, living alone, or had access to outdoors. The main part of the survey was the questionnaires. So we invited the participants to imagine their life before the COVID-19 pandemic. We asked them to focus on how they felt in the UK before they introduced social isolation measures and maybe recall a week from September to December of 2019. We then asked them to answer the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, and after answering this questionnaire, we asked them to again remember how they felt before the COVID-19 pandemic and then complete the life satisfaction scale. After completing this set of questionnaires, the participants were then asked to think about their life during the COVID-19 pandemic, in particular when UK was having strict social distancing measures, such as May 2020. We then asked them to complete the wellbeing scale and the life satisfaction scale again. And finally, in the last stage of this section, we asked the participants to think about how their life was now with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. For the participants, this was just after January 2021 to probably March 2021. We then asked them to fill in the questionnaires of the mental wellbeing scale and the life satisfaction scale. So then we had our general questions. They were long answer questions that we asked our participants to explore the actual effects on the COVID-19 mentally, so they could talk to us about how it affected them. We also asked questions such as if they had access to any support, the kinds of positive experiences they had, how long they expected this time to have on them. And we found that due to us researchers being also exposed to the COVID-19 pandemic, we had a possibility to be biased in how we interpreted our answers. So we ensured that every single answer was done as a collective so that we could ignore this bias of how we interpreted the results. Our study also adhered to the BPS and the BACP guidelines for ethical research and practice. This study was also approved by the Bangor University School of Psychology, Research Ethics and Governance Committee. So I decided to show our results using the wellbeing scores first and then the life satisfaction scores. So for our wellbeing scores, the results showed an overall significant effect between conditions. Here you can see a bar graph looking at the female and the male differences between the before, during and after scores of well-being. You can see on each bar graph that the well-being scores were much higher in the before and then decreased in the lower and again increased in the after condition. The before lockdown and during lockdown showed the most sizable variation. We did this again with the life satisfaction scores. So as you can see on the bar graph, the results displayed a general significant result between conditions. Again, here you can see a much more dramatic difference. The before scores were much higher than the during scores, and then again, the scores elevated in the after condition. Before lockdown and during lockdown shows the most sizable variation again, which suggested that to our participants, during the pandemic was probably the hardest part for each individual participant. So after looking at the wellbeing scores and the life satisfaction scores, we also wanted to compare these with our general lockdown questions. For example, the living status. Participants who answered yes to living alone scored lower on the satisfied with life questionnaires compared to those who answered no. This suggests that those living alone during the lockdown perceived their life as being less satisfactory than those who were living with others. We also did this with the mental health disorders. Those who disclosed having a mental health disorder scored lower in the wellbeing questionnaire compared to those who answered no to having a mental health disorder, which suggests that those people who had a mental health disorder were maybe influenced more by the negative experiences of the lockdown. However, it is important to show that the during and the after the lockdown, there was some improvement shown with the people who did answer yes. When posing the question of how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the United Kingdom's population on mental well-being and life satisfaction, the results of our research suggested that well-being and life satisfaction have taken consequences. The largest effect identified was being seen to take place during the lockdown in both well-being and life satisfaction scores, as well as in the long answer questions. The results suggested this effect was mainly seen in the during lockdown period, where participants reported various drivers for altered perceived quality of life, such as struggles with loneliness, anxiety, and low mood. Our results showed a strong indication of well-being and satisfaction with life being affected during the lockdowns, with particular focus on loneliness and reported feelings of living alone. With our results showing lower life satisfaction scores for people who lived alone than those living with people, we can consider the idea that being alone at a time when you're legally not allowed to socialise can affect the life satisfaction majorly, and implies social isolation enhances the negative effects of a pandemic on mental well-being. When looking at the well-being of our participants during the lockdown and after the lockdown, those who disclosed having mental health disorder consistently scored lower on the questionnaire. This demonstrates that some information should be put in place to support people who struggle with mental health, especially during a time where a rise in depressional symptoms may expand. It seems important to highlight that there were some positive implications of the lockdown too, when looking at the impact of our participants, highlighted as importance on their confidence as they finally had time to focus on themselves, in which they could prioritise dealing more effectively with anxiety. This was also highlighted in positive experiences during the lockdown, where participants revealed finding a new self and incorporated feelings of feeling closer to those around them. So after conducting our analysis on our data, we then did a qualitative data looking at our long answer themes. In each box here, you'll see the question we asked to our participants and the kind of themes, the most common themes we collated from the participants. For example, the first box says, in what way did the COVID-19 pandemic affect your mental health or well-being? So our most common answers were an increase of stress and anxiety, an increase of loneliness, and an increase of depressive feelings. We also asked our participants whether they accessed any support during the pandemic, and if they answered yes, we found that the most common themes were CBT and counselling accesses, and also access through the medium of friends and family. If our participants answered no to accessing support, we asked them why, and the most common themes were that they did not feel necessary, they didn't feel like they needed it most at that time, they didn't know where to access the support, and the waiting lists were far too long. Finally, we asked our participants what the biggest challenges for them was during the pandemic, and the biggest challenge we saw was not being able to see family and friends, and also this lack of freedom. We also asked our participants had they had any positive experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic. The most positive experiences found were those feeling closer to those around them. This was expressed through our university students' answers, who said that due to moving home to parents, they felt closer to their parents, and they'd also become better at communicating and messaging with their friends. Another positive experience was realising a lot about themselves. So our participants created answers showing that they'd found new interests in hobbies, new interests in finding themselves, in developing their confidence, developing their anxious feelings, and overall a really positive message was shown. When we asked our participants what the main lesson they've learned during the COVID-19 pandemic, we found three main things which all really interplayed with each other. The first one was don't take things for granted. The second was prioritize friends and family. And the third one was prioritizing self. But in these common themes, they all overlapped because by not taking things for granted, we're also prioritizing friends and family and prioritizing the self. When asking how long did we expect the impact on the mental health and well-being to last, a lot of our participants had varying answers, but the overall main theme was when things get back to normal, and in this it was for the foreseeable future. This is because when things get back to normal and the foreseeable future were the exact same thing for most of our participants, they just didn't know when things would get back to normal, so therefore it was the foreseeable future. So, looking at our research, there was some implications and possible need for future research. First implication was that we were unable to conduct our study in a controlled environment. This is due to the nature of the pandemic. Ideally, we might have been able to present the questionnaires with people, so if they had any questions to ask, we would be there to answer them. The second implication we found was the amount of support provided to our participants. From looking at the research and the data we collected, it seemed that there was a lot of sensitive nature and maybe a possible need for more support for our participants. Ideally, signposting to more places than just the free Bangor University Samaritans and the GP. Our third implication was the lockdowns and timeframes chosen. Within the UK, there were many different areas experiencing different times of lockdowns at different times throughout the year. So it could have been necessary to specify which pandemic and which lockdown that we were actually talking about in this time. This was also seen in when we asked our participants to recall the experiences. It was kind of hard to actually access the true nature of the scores. For example, asking to recall before the pandemic after they've been through such a hard time, it might have been hard for them to actually reach that point of knowing what life was actually like beforehand. Therefore, I feel like there is a need for a further follow-up studies. Firstly, for when the pandemic actually ends, so we can see this true effect on how the pandemic has influenced mental health and well-being, and maybe making that specific to the certain areas within the UK and their own lockdowns. With this, we'd have to adjust the long answer questions to explore what the most challenging point of the lockdown was for each participant. And then this also calls for a further follow-up study afterwards, looking at a few years after the pandemic ends to see if this influence can still be seen. Another follow-up study that I think would be important to analyse would be the loneliness and elderly. Due to a lot of elderly people having to shield due to the pandemic and exposing to the coronavirus, it might be important to look at this loneliness of how it has impacted them individually. With that, I just want to say thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this PowerPoint as much as I've actually enjoyed collecting this data and analysing it all. It's been fantastic to work with. Please feel free to leave any comments and questions below. I'll be here to answer them when I can. And I hope you have a nice day. My references are on the next slide.